Now that I'm a dad with number 2 coming hopefully in about a year, conventional wisdom tells me a few things. First, I'm insane. Second, I'm never going to sleep again. Third, I'm not going to have any money anymore. And fourth, I must immediately run out and buy a minivan. Of course, it's not just conventional wisdom, because on the merch store we do have a complete line of minivan themed merch, so be sure and check that out. Today we're taking a look at my favorite minivan in America. If I were to buy a minivan today, I would buy a Chrysler Pacifica plug-in hybrid. I think this is currently the best minivan available for a few reasons which we're going to talk about in this video, but we need to talk about something else first. And that would be the very foundational question. Do I need a minivan? Do you need a minivan? Is minivan still the right answer? Or is the new crop of large family SUVs simply better than any minivan? And I'm talking about the Grand Highlander, the Acadia, the Traverse, the Palisade, the Enclave, and this growing group of unibody front-wheel drive-based big family SUVs. Not a Tahoe or a Suburban, because there's still a logical reason to get a minivan over a full-size body-on-frame SUV. These are less expensive, they drive better, they're more fuel efficient, etc. But the same thing cannot be said for this new crop of big family SUVs. Compared to some of those large SUVs, the Pacifica and the rest of the minivan competition still have the classic minivan box shape. So really high roofline, goes all the way to the back, and a really vertical hatch, which drastically improves cargo practicality, but gives this that van-like look that not everybody is a fan of. Others may not be a fan of the price tag. For 2025, this starts at $53,050, including destination. That bumps up to $54,255 for 2026. We're going to be talking 2026 pricing mainly in this video because if you were to run out and buy one of these in the next few months, chances are you're probably going to end up in a 2026. As tested here, $63,050 for 2026. Although the average Pacifica plug-in hybrid currently has about $6,000 of incentive spend on it, and chances are you will get between 10 and 15% off the MSRP on any Pacifica on the Chrysler dealer lot. You definitely need to factor that into its pricing when you're comparing this against the Kia Carnival or a Honda Odyssey or a Toyota Sienna, all of which tend to sell much closer to their MSRPs. But there is another problem. At the end of September, the $7,500 tax credit goes away. And that is what has always made the Pacifica plug-in such a fantastic deal. And a big part of the reason I would buy this over the competitors. Because after the tax credit and the cash on the hood, this would end up right around $48,000 or $49,000. Now, admittedly, there are a decent number of SUVs you could buy for $48,000 or $49,000. Palisade, Acadia, Grand Highlander, etc. Now don't get me wrong, minivans still have a lot of advantages, like a big opening window here in the second row, and of course the power sliding doors that are ubiquitous in the minivan segment. That gives us a really large opening to get in and out of the vehicle, and you don't have to worry about kids opening and closing it on their own. And it's going to be easier for them because the floor is closer to the ground. It's about 5 to 6 inches lower to the ground than the average SUV that this is competing with. Well, the roofline is definitely higher than average, and it's much squarer in this area, easier to get kids and child seats and adults with mobility issues in and out of the vehicle. Definitely a solid reason to get a minivan. The downside to that is the design of the average minivan. We get less ground clearance than we find in the competition, so if you were worried about off-roading ability or soft-roading ability, winter ability, etc. And of course, most minivans don't have all-wheel drive. Now, Chrysler does offer that in the regular gasoline version of the Pacifica, and Toyota offers all-wheel drive in the Sienna, but it's an all-wheel drive system with a pretty small electric motor in the back, and there are compromises for offering those features in the various vehicles. Then there's a subject that's near and dear to my heart, cargo capacity. Not only can a minivan swallow 10-foot items like this conduit, every minivan in America can also accommodate a 4x8 sheet of plywood, or a 4x8 sheet of whatever you might want to take home with you. But that's something that fewer and fewer people do. Let me digress for a moment and say that DIY is not as popular as it once was, but in my family, that is not the case. When I say we built our own home, I mean literally every stud, every pound of concrete, every floor joist, every nook and cranny, we did 100% ourselves. and we carried to the building site in a vehicle we own, mostly on a trailer, of course. And a lot of this is just too big to fit in a minivan conveniently. So for me, the minivan doesn't exactly check that particular box. And yes, I know for any tradespeople watching, that's why some items are a little rough and ready, but you know what? We're not going to focus on my HVAC ducting skills today. But back to the minivan. Because they didn't have to worry about off-road capability or exactly driving dynamics, they were able to use a rear suspension design that was a lot more compact than most of those big family SUV competitors. And that allows the rear seats to do this very minivan thing where they flip and fold into this cargo well in the back of the minivan. That's the big reason that minivans have such fantastic storage capability. The other reality, of course, is that there's practically no departure angle to speak of, and that's definitely what gives this back end that classic minivan look. The regular Pacifica has a few other tricks up its sleeve. Second row seats that fold flat into the floor and a storage area that you can use when the seat is not in that position. That's precluded by the battery pack in the hybrid model. And second row seats that let you leave a child seat latch anchored into place, forward facing of course, and still easily access the third row. With those bulky child seats getting bigger every year, that's a really handy touch, but not something that we find in the hybrid minivan because this has removable second row captain's chairs that tilt like that, and then the whole seat slides forward in that manner, precluding that child seat from staying in that position. Of course, these do come out of the vehicle. You fold it down, pull that little webbing there, and then kind of rock it forward until it actually comes out of its latchings. This is not the most convenient seat to get in and out or move around, but it is notably lighter than the one that's in the Odyssey. And importantly, none of the competition on the SUV side have removable second row seats. And I've always thought that was a big misstep because it wouldn't be that hard to use this same sort of latch mechanism on something like a Grand Highlander. And how cool would that be? Let's shift gears and talk about the lack of gears under the hood. At its core, this hybrid system is very similar to the hybrid system in the Toyota Sienna. We have a gasoline engine on that side, and we have 2 motor generator units and a single planetary gear set on this side. Fundamentally, architecturally, this is the same hybrid system that Toyota has used for decades and decades. And at its core, mechanically, this is very reliable. The reliability issues for the Pacifica have mainly centered on some battery concerns. There were some manufacturing defects by the manufacturer of the battery cells, and then of course the control systems for the transmission, which again, architecturally is very like the Toyota system. The 3.6 liter V6, it's very similar to the one in the regular Pacifica, but it's been modified to run on the Atkinson cycle, so it produces a bit less horsepower and of course less torque as well. That's not a problem because we get the 2 electric motors on this side that together give this system 260 horsepower. It's powered by a 16 kilowatt-hour lithium-ion battery pack positioned under that second row of seats. About 12 kilowatt-hours of that pack is usable, so you can see that Chrysler is actually being pretty conservative with the amount of battery that you have access to. Battery longevity has not been a problem at all in the Pacifica Hybrid so far. When everything is working together, you'll get 32 miles of electric range, 30 miles per gallon, and more operating costs that are actually less than most of the competition, which is the interesting twist. So even though you'll get 36 miles per gallon in a Sienna, in reality, you really won't. This is actually more efficient in regular driving than that Sienna. Even if you did get 36 though, that would cost you about $1,300 a year in fuel cost. This is around $1,200 a year, and the Kia Carnival Hybrid, it's around $1,400 a year because of its slightly lower fuel economy. Range, also kind of an interesting twist. You'll get the most driving range in a Sienna, 648 miles of range, assuming you could get 36 miles per gallon, of course. In this, you'll get 520, but on my driving cycle, I would actually end up with about 2,500 miles of driving range. Even if I only plugged this in at home or at the office, but not at both, I would average about 1,500 miles on a gasoline tank. And that is one of the biggest advantages to a plug-in hybrid like this. It's the fact that if you have screaming kids inside, you don't need to stop to fill it up with gas. You can just drive on home, and then you can deal with whatever's happening at home, plug it in. 2 hours later, you will have a full battery pack and another 30 plus miles of range. Or if you don't want to install an EVSE at home, you don't have to, because this will charge on a regular electrical outlet in about 9 to 10 hours. So it's definitely very convenient. And if you live in a cold climate or a hot climate, you can precondition your vehicle in your garage with the garage door closed because it'll be running on electricity, as long as it's plugged in, of course. If you're a taller driver, have longer legs, or just like sitting in an upright sitting position, there's definitely a reason to get a minivan. Even with the seat in that upright position and this panoramic moonroof, my head's not touching the ceiling at 6 feet tall, and you can definitely move this seat quite far rearward and still have a lot of room for child seats and adults in the second row. There's just so much room going on here, and that's all, again, thanks to the very boxy nature of the average minivan. We have a manual tilt telescopic steering column with a pretty decent range of motion, and in this trim, the passenger seat has the exact same range of motion as the driver's seat. That's one reason you might want to check out the Chrysler over some of the competition if you have a spouse or a partner that really wants a more comfortable, more adjustable passenger seat. The vibe in the second row is definitely different than the average SUV, because even though we don't have a completely flat floor in minivans anymore, we don't have that stadium step style seating that we find in so many SUVs and crossovers. The second row seat's about the same height as the first row seat. The third row seat is really not that far behind. And then of course we get tons of legroom. You can see with this front seat adjuster for me at 6 feet tall, I have gobs and gobs of legroom left there. Headroom also pretty generous. Even though we have this panoramic moonroof, I have about 2 inches of headroom left there. Now in the hybrid model, you cannot get 8 passenger capability because of the added weight of that battery pack. So it's simply 2 here in the middle and then 3 back here in the way back. And now for the mother-in-law row. Again, I am surprised that those second row seats do not tilt and slide forward with a child seat latch anchored into place, but oddly enough, neither do any of the other minivans in the US. That is exclusively a Chrysler thing, something that's always surprised me with the family focus of minivans. Back here in the third row, we have one of the best third rows around. In the Honda Odyssey, I found that the opening and the hinges for the hatch really restrict headroom. So even though on those figures it would look like headroom's pretty comparable, in reality, we get more room around the head for adults back here in the third row. And this is still one of the reasons to get this over something like a Grand Highlander or an Acadia. The third row is a little bit wider and a little bit more comfortable, but the difference, it's not as big as it used to be. Yes, this is still wider because of that ability again for a 48-inch wide thing to fit back here, and that means that the middle seat is certainly more comfortable than average. How many people are really sitting in it though? That I just don't know. On the other hand, the third row does get 2 sets of latch anchors. One that's pretty centered over here on this 40% folding side, and one that's right here in the middle of the 60% folding side. So if you use that one, you can't put 2 people in the back, just one child seat occupying that side, but you would be able to fit another child seat over here. So if you're responsible for the child seat daycare run, you know, this would actually work pretty well. Hard plastics obviously are going around pretty much everywhere back here because even though this is more of a passenger space than in the average SUV, you know, it's still really going to spend a lot of time with cargo in here. The lack of stadium-style seating is definitely an advantage when it comes to not having your knees in your chest, because even though headroom figures are similar to some of the SUV competition, this seat bottom cushion is higher off the ground than in most of those, and that really makes it more comfortable for adults or kids with longer legs. All right, let's talk a bit more about child seats. Obviously, we have the big opening, which makes it easier to get kids in and out of the vehicle, but we also have tons of room. The driver's seat is adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, and as you can see, we have a lot of room for a rear-facing child seat like this. We also have that completely flat floor, which makes it easier to toss diaper bags, things like that in. Of course, child seats with the load leg, those are really easy to attach as well. The latch anchors are easy to find, no doors or flaps in the way, and the headrests are adjustable so you can pass that top tether anchor through there rather than going on top of the headrest. There were some rumors that 2026 would bring an interior refresh. It in fact did not, so the interior is exactly the same. We find buttons for the panoramic sunroof and its shade right there, sunglass holder, buttons for the power doors and power hatch, slide to the side sun visors. Since this is the top-end Pinnacle trim, the entire ceiling is done in that Alcantara-like imitation suede fabric. We have that big panoramic moonroof right there with controls for the rear climate control zone right there by that air vent. 4-way ratchet-style head restraints for the driver and front passenger, height-adjustable shoulder belts, and of course a very 1990s rear seat entertainment system. I kid, this is actually one of the better RSEs that's out there, but I just think they're just not useful anymore because tablet computers have become so inexpensive. The look of the seats in the first and second row is very similar, but they're not quite as comfortable, not quite as adjustable. The front row seats here are heated and ventilated, and again, the passenger seat has 4-way lumbar. I really like this sort of, baseball glove brown style seat with the white piping. It really gives this an elegant look. Moving over to the doors, we have kind of a two-tone color scheme going on with that same color match to the seat. Hard plastics down there on the bottom, including that brown section, kind of a two-tiered storage bin setup there right around that speaker grille. Soft touch materials on the upper part of that door and on the upper part of the dashboard. This dashboard definitely harkens back to a different era at Chrysler, so it definitely kind of gives me Chrysler 200 vibes. Not sure if that's good or bad, probably mostly bad. Down here at the bottom of the dash, soft touch materials, reasonably sized bin-style glove compartment, although not big enough to fit an 11-inch tablet computer inside. And then in the middle of everything, we actually have the latest Chrysler Uconnect software that gives us things like Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, as well as PowerFlow, things like that from the hybrid system. There were some rumors that maybe we would get a bigger screen or updated systems, etc. That has not happened. I don't think that's a problem because Uconnect is pretty easy to live with. I've actually been living with it for a while in a Durango, and nothing's really gone wrong with the system. I think it's just totally fine. Very similar functionality, really, to most of the competition, and this approximately 10-inch screen I think is okay for the dashboard. Down here we have a rotary-style shifter. This is not my favorite because of where park is located. This makes three-point turns trickier than the ones where the park option is a button in the middle, because in a three-point turn situation, I find myself accidentally going to park or just missing it and ending up in neutral, and that's just kind of a pain in the butt. Parking brake right there, controls for the climate control system here. I do appreciate that there are lots of physical controls. The controls for the heated and ventilated seats, though, and the heated steering wheel, those are up here in the touchscreen, so a little bit less convenient in my opinion. Down here we have the Blu-ray player for that rear seat entertainment system, single charging mat right there, USB input for the rear system as well, USB inputs for this front system, and I love the fact that we still get those 4 USB ports there. Big chunky cup holders right there. This is what the key looks like if you've ever wondered. Buttons for the power doors, remote start, power hatch in the back, etc. We have decently sized storage compartment right there. That's a little bit smaller than you might think, of course, because we get that large under section right there for storage. And in the rear seat area, we have this really long drawer that comes out of that center console so the kids can store their goodies away. The one area where I kind of wish we had had an update is the instrument cluster, because again, this harkens back to a kind of a different era at Chrysler. We have the power and charge gauge over here on this side, physical gauge, fuel gauge, huge over there on the right, and then everything else is right here in the middle. The software itself is pretty good. We have audio readouts, messages, you can set up your screen there, you have a digital speedometer if you want that, vehicle info, lots of information, battery voltage, tire pressure, things like that. Driver assist systems, and the hybrid information screen, which I do think is kind of cool because it shows you how much power is coming from the battery, being pulled from the battery, and how much is coming from the engine. But again, kind of a small screen. The steering wheel, that's nice and comfortable. I do prefer thickly rimmed wheels, and we definitely find one here, something that we've known from Chrysler for a while. We have buttons that control that multifunction display over here on this side, buttons for the voice command system and phone hang-up and pickup over here, and then dedicated buttons over here for regular cruise control and then adaptive cruise control. The volume and track and forward buttons and back buttons, etc., those are all on the back of the steering wheel. So volume up, down over here on this side, track forward, backward on the other side. Historically, the reason to buy a minivan over an SUV was that they rode better, they handled better, they were quieter, they were more efficient, they were roomier, all of that at the same time. But this is 2025, not 2005 or 1995 anymore, and the competitive landscape of SUVs has definitely changed, whereas minivans, they've stayed about the same. So a lot of this no longer applies as directly as it used to. For instance, going a little bit out of order, even though this has 60 series tires on it, 235 60R18, so more tire cushion than we find in the average SUV, the ride quality is not necessarily better. It's good, don't get me wrong, and I'm still going to give this an A compared to a lot of SUVs out there, but it's not as comfortable as those tires would lead you to believe. Not as comfortable, certainly, as some of those big SUVs with adaptive air suspensions or other kinds of adaptive damper technology. Those can definitely make the ride more comfortable than this minivan. But perhaps more important than that is the design of the rear suspension. Back in time, this was competing with vehicles that had solid axles in the back. Now, it's competing with SUVs like Palisade and Grand Highlander that have fully independent rear suspensions. And on rougher paved roads like this, you will definitely notice the difference in control. Those feel better put together, a little bit more secure. Like the rest of the minivan competition, there are definitely times where across broken pavement, you get a little bit of rear end chatter, the rear suspension's not quite as settled, you can't drive this quite as hard out on your favorite winding mountain road like this as you could in something that's a little bit higher off the ground. Also, a lot of those SUVs have wider tires than we find in this model, and that's perhaps why they have better 0 to 60 and 60 to 0 stopping distances. Because in this model, even though we have only 260 horsepower, we have a lot of weight to pull around, so if I stop and I floor it, we do get a little bit of front wheel slip, and that affects our 0 to 60 time, which is acceptable for this segment, 7.5 seconds in our testing in this 2025 model. Versus something like a Carnival hybrid, this is definitely swifter 0 to 60, but it's not really too far off where we find that Toyota Sienna. The horsepower figures are actually pretty comparable to the Sienna as our torque figures. The difference, of course, is that this can stay in EV mode a lot longer, and it can regenerate more power into the battery because it has that big battery. And that's why I think even without charging the battery, this gets better fuel economy in mountainous or hilly driving than the Sienna, because it's able to regenerate that power all the way back down the hill. On my daily commute, once I've crossed over Highway 17 and I start regenerating power all the way down into Silicon Valley, I get about 5 miles of EV range recovered, whereas in a Carnival hybrid or a Sienna hybrid, I would get a fractional mile or something like that back into their battery. And that's one of the reasons I think that fuel economy for me, and in my test loop, tends to be better in this than in those other options. But then we have that ability to operate electric only. And the battery cooling and the motor cooling setup here is definitely targeted towards staying in EV mode as long as possible. So climbing up hills, you can climb up decent grades, absolutely no problem, stay in electric only operation. It can heat the cabin, it can cool the cabin in electric operation. And if you need that extra power, you floor it, you get the engine to rev up, and then you take your foot back off the pedal, most times it's actually going to shut off the engine pretty quickly. So if you're that kind of person that gets offended that a plug-in hybrid system doesn't return to EV operation rapidly, don't worry, this will do that. The added weight though, that does stretch out the stopping distance to 125 feet. Pretty similar to most of those SUV competitors. Some of them are going to stop a little bit shorter thanks to their wider tires. There are a decent number of competitors to this in the mainstream segment that now have 255 millimeter wide tires, 265 millimeter wide tires, even wider in some of those options that are maybe a little bit sportier. So definitely a bit more horizontal grip. Also lateral grip when you're stopping and going. And it's really that handling ability that is surprising. Once upon a time, we used to say minivans were the practical thing that handled like a car, and you know, they kind of do. If we're talking about maybe a 1980s, early 1990s inexpensive vehicle that didn't have a fully independent suspension in the back. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just not as refined as it could be. Of course, if this did have a refined rear suspension, it wouldn't be a minivan. You would be losing cargo space in the back, and that's part of why we have that huge cargo area. In our cabin noise testing, bear in mind they repaved the road recently that we test on. We measured 64 decibels in here at 50 miles an hour, which puts this right in line with most of those SUV competitors. Some of the newer ones though, with those upper end trims like we find in the new Palisade calligraphy, etc., those can be a bit quieter even though they do have wider tires, and some of them will perform better 0 to 60 than this. Fuel efficiency, we definitely need to talk about that because this is really punching above its weight. We've been averaging 35.5 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving when we weren't charging it. When we were charging it, if we calculate this the way that most plug-in hybrids calculate it, I was averaging about 110 miles per gallon, treating that electricity as if it were free. And that is one twist. If you want me to go into greater detail about this in a different video, I will. But in a nutshell, Chrysler and Jeep with their plug-in hybrids, they calculate plug-in hybrid fuel economy really, really strangely. So the number that's there in the instrument cluster is actually lower than reality, even if you're not charging the vehicle. It's a really dumb concept, but they're really, really dedicated to it. Again, I can dive into that deeper if you want to, maybe in the comment section. It's stupid. This actually does perform really well when it comes to fuel economy. And the hybrid system is very smooth because, again, it uses the same design as the hybrid system in a classic Toyota hybrid. No gears to change, there are no steps. Engagement for the engine is really, really smooth. And we also have pretty aggressive regeneration capability because we have that big battery pack. So versus something like a Sienna hybrid where that battery pack will get full and then it's going to have to start using the engine to try and give you a consistent regeneration feel, but it's never able to regenerate that much quote-unquote power. Those long downhill runs, you're going to end up using your brakes more. This, on the other hand, really can, because we have that big battery pack and it can stuff a lot of power easily into it. So it's not quite one-pedal driving, but it's one of the closer plug-in hybrids out there. You can get a pretty decent amount of regeneration just using your foot on the accelerator pedal. In a nutshell, the driving nature of the average minivan has not changed appreciably over the last 10, 20, even 30 years. But the driving nature of the average family-focused SUV certainly has. This is not a world where we have Trailblazers or Durangos with body-on-frame construction and solid axles in the rear. Thanks for the turn signal there, buddy. This is a different world. This is a world where we have unibody SUVs with all-wheel drive, with decent ground clearance, with independent suspensions that are selling in big numbers because people are expecting them to drive, honestly, more like a family sedan while having that big cargo box in the back. And that same focus has not been applied to minivans, at least not yet. Now for the million-dollar question. Do you need a minivan? Do I need a minivan? If so, which one would I get? And what else might I choose instead of a minivan? Well, that's tricky. Minivans still logically have their place. Versus those big SUVs, we still have a more practical interior. It's still easier to park than a Suburban or a Tahoe, with more usable space on the inside than many full-size SUVs, and more comfortable seats, and greater efficiency, and better handling, and all that, compared to something like a Chevy Tahoe. Even the base Chevy Tahoe is going to be more expensive than this and a lot less efficient. The trouble is, we have some really good family-focused big three-row SUVs out there that we did not have when the Pacifica was envisioned, and honestly, when any of the other minivans were originally created either. We didn't have the Grand Highlander, the current generation Traverse, Acadia, Enclave, the new Palisade, which has grown considerably and become significantly more family-focused than previous generations. They still do not have the cargo capacity of a minivan like this. They still don't have a third row that's quite as big as this, but they're a lot less compromised. And there are other things going on that you might like in those, like all-wheel drive capability. They're not going to be as off-road capable as a Grand Cherokee or something, but they have approach, breakover, and departure angles and ground clearance that is significantly better than any minivan, even if you added all-wheel drive to a regular Pacifica or you got a Sienna with the all-wheel drive setup. So this is still about practicality, but its focus has really been narrowed because there are some great options out there for someone that wants something a little bit more rugged, differently styled, still has a hybrid, maybe has a hybrid and all-wheel drive, but more mechanical capability than we find in the average minivan. And in some situations may be actually better driving, because that is not the case for this versus a Palisade, a Grand Highlander, etc. Those are actually better driving out on the road than a minivan, even some of the best handling minivans in the US. Honda Odyssey, I would still take a Palisade over the Odyssey if you're worried about handling, although I don't know if either customer really is or not. So for me at least, I would not pick a minivan. I think I would get something like the Palisade, the Acadia, or the Grand Highlander, maybe in that order, because I do think all three of those are really solid family vehicles. But if you wanted that extra layer of practicality, that extra layer of cargo efficiency, and a plug-in hybrid system that is very family friendly, then I would choose the Pacifica. And that hybrid system is certainly one reason to choose this over those regular hybrid SUVs. They don't have plug-in hybrids over there, but we do have one here. And that is kind of a really great feature. The practicality, the ability to charge at home, to not have to worry about stopping for fuel on your regular commute when you're just dropping your kids off at daycare, going to the office, trying to go back home, trying to do this, trying to do that. You have the option to plug in. You don't need to plug in if you don't want to. Oddly enough, even without plugging it in, we got better fuel economy in our testing than in Carnival Hybrid or Sienna Hybrid. But you have that ability to shift some of that over to electricity, and importantly, gain that extra convenience of being able to remote start your car in Houston in a closed garage, or in Chicago in the winter in a closed garage, that you wouldn't be able to do in those gasoline counterparts. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comments section below. And what would you choose? Are you still team minivan? Or is the modern minivan really the big unibody crossover in America? I'd argue it kind of is. See all of you later.